So I'm going to talk about a story as old as Icarus and as old as Moses, because as long as men and women and children have been on the earth, they've taken to the sea for safety and in search of a better life. And that idea is really relevant to the paper and to the research project and to the whole creative project as well. Because I'm also going to talk about authenticity in storytelling, especially as it relates to children and young people. And I think probably most people in this room have the same conviction as well, but I have a serious conviction that fiction, poetry, art is an excellent way of helping children to make sense of the world. We kind of know this as academics, but the amount of people who don't take that seriously is really quite bad, really. And so if we can try and do something about that, which this project is going to try and do. So stories invite them, and indeed us, to discover what it's like being someone else, or somewhere completely different. They invite us to encounter the real world in a different way. And if we can introduce children to the idea of story and real stories with real meanings early on in their lives, then their understanding of the world as adults becomes more enriched. We kind of got to try and catch them young in that respect. So I want to start by addressing some of the issues that we have with regard to writing for children so that we can move on to the wider brief of it. Children, wrote Walter Benjamin, are less intrigued by the performed world that adults have created for them than that which they can create from their own imagination. And so it's unlikely Benjamin would be surprised to learn that the child in childhood is the target of a highly developed market-driven capitalist economy, or that a lot of the critical material targeted at the practice of creating culture for children, like stories and books and films and television, etc., and toys, overlaps with a wider picture on critical and cultural transmission and the complexities of storytelling in this modern 21st century world, which itself cannot be separated or critiqued in isolation from many of the other components or the other component parts of that world. The world of the tablet, the smartphone, the iPad, the computer. Children are already seriously well conversant with the whole kind of computer technology dialogue, etc., aren't they? So in the face of a market-driven electronic televisual world, what chance does a story have to be a force for good in the life of a developing child? And if anybody's ever gone on to the internet and looked at books that have been written for children or material that's been written for children, I mean, there's a lot of rubbish out there, really seriously awful, because the people who make that stuff think that the only credentials they need is to be an adult. It's mostly extraordinary stuff. So, what chance does a story have? A small story. Because it's such a small thing, really. No more than a fragment, an untangling of a small bunch of words. How can it survive the age of electronic imagery, television, and the advancing computer and internet technology that we have confronting us every single day of our lives? And as Jack Zipes says, I put this up here, stories get buried under so much other stuff. It's simply impossible to discuss stories today without situating them within the complex cultural field of production in which young people are introduced to a variety of commodities connected to a book, story, or poem that they're reading. And this is getting worse in terms of how they can access through phones and iPads and that kind of thing as well. In relation to this, though, why should any story survive? Is story not already redundant? It is to some extent. And this is really important, I think, because sometimes we need to remind ourselves or remind other people, especially from an academic context, and even our own students, we have to remind them sometimes that story is what separates us from any other species. Homo fabula, we're the story species, that's how we trade, that's how we live, that's how we engage and work. So it's clear then, in this still new 21st century, children, young people, are being defined more and more by adult-given, child-centered commodification, advertised lifestyles, media, and an unalienable cultural crisis wrapped up in the irrepressible rise of capitalism. And we know who owns all the money in the world. You know, don't think Rupert Murdoch really cares about children, does he? Does he? No, he cares about the money. The 1% pay rise we got, you know. Yeah? But for the storyteller in cultural practice to be aware of this allows for a certain amount of resistance. But this is not without its problems either. So I'll go on to explain a wee bit more about this idea of resistance, because too many people get it wrong. You know, and you can see the material. We walk into Waterson's bookshops and you can take stuff off the shelves and you think, why did they do that? You know, why is that there? Nowhere are power structures as obvious as they are in the relationship between adults and children. They extend through home, health, education, educators, extended family, social and cultural exchanges. And in the culture, adults produce for children, such as toys, books, television shows, etc., all of which are created by those in power, by adults, for the powerless, children. That's how it works. We have this constant, as parents, do as you're told. Why? Because I'm telling you, because it's an adult thing, isn't it? We're adults. Can we do that with children? But doctors do that with children, teachers do it with children, and nurses do it with children, and television, everybody does it with children to that extent. And this is the great one as well, because the only qualification required to be an expert in this field, seemingly, the only qualification, seemingly, is to be an adult. You know this. You've been in the we were talking about this today, when you're in the supermarket and you see somebody slapping their 18-month-old kid and said, I told you not to do that. Do you think the child understood the request not to do something at 18 months? There's no chance. But, because he's the adult, he says he's the expert. This is kind of how it works. So subsequently, so too is the idea that most people see the child as other to adults. Adults and children, polar opposites. And yet, I have a problem with this as well, because I don't. To label the child as other, which replicates that master-servant, oppressor-oppressed, male-female, adult child in the same analogue as women, gay people, people of colour, etc., is not a convincing argument for me, because children occupy a radically different social space. Theirs is contingent and generally temporary in a way that is only ever shadowed in all the other demographic categories. They truly are in a process of becoming, not being, but becoming the woman, the black person, the gay. So we can't have feminism for children. We can't have childism. This thing called childism, because, they can't get together in a room and say, we want the vote, or something like suffragettes. There's no kind of mechanism for the, and they're temporary anyway, because by the time they've agreed that they want the vote, they come out, they're adults, and they've already moved out the space that they occupy. And so we can't label them other in that respect. It doesn't make any sense to me. Those other demographic categories are pretty well stuck with their markers, aren't they? But a child is an identity under erasure. The child only has a few years before he or she is camouflaged as one of us. This is what we become, 50 years later, 60 years later, And all those mark groups are conspicuous on the basis of their morphology, made up of its interconnected or interdependent parts, while the child is marked more on the basis of their stage of socialization and their capacity to understand and be educated and to grow as well. And I've got another slide for you. It is now recognised that children think and reason in the same way as adults from early childhood. Cognitive development is experience dependent, and older children have had more experiences than younger children, according to Goswami. And if anybody's interested in developing this, Livingston wrote a fantastic book on children and media, if anybody's interested, in children's culture and media. It's an absolutely excellent book. She did a lot of research on with qualitative research, quantitative research, and all that kind of stuff as well. So it's really good book. So this is where story comes in then. Older children, essentially, cognitive development is experience dependent, and older children have more experiences than young children. It's kind of obvious. So this is where story comes in. Story is a kind of meeting place where vicarious experience can be negotiated and located. And we all know vicarious experiences well. You know, I don't have to put my fingers into the plug socket to know that I'll get an electric shock and it won't be very pleasant and all that kind of thing, because my dad told me not to do it, and so I won't do it. Okay. You know, you don't put your hand in the fire because you know it's going to burn. Okay. Maybe after a few drinks you'll drink a Zambuco with a flame still on top of it and burn your nose. That'll teach you. But, you know, so vicarious experience is something that can be negotiated through story. What is actually taking place in the cultural process of storytelling is, yes, an adult is articulating for children, but at the same time, children who already know more than he or she can articulate at any given time in their lives are learning how to articulate their own story while also learning something new. And this is really important. Children know more than they can articulate at any time in their lives because they don't have the language for it, they don't have the words for it, they don't have the understanding, but eventually they find these things out. But basically what happens is that the language kind of catches up with you know, what they understand. They understand it. They understand people being bad-tempered or grumpy, but they don't understand why, or they understand why people are swearing but they don't really understand why. And eventually the understand kind of follows what they actually know. And so at the same time, so they can, what they're doing is that they're learning to articulate their own story while at the same time they're working with, they're learning something new from adult storytellers, artists, stage plays, that whole thing. But before we just kind of wade into this, there's also something else that needs to be considered. And a lot of the critical stuff I've read over the years and years and years and years on children's fiction, and they just don't get it. In fact, the last time I gave a paper on kid lit was in Dublin, and I got harangued by two professors of literature, one from Newcastle and one from Bolton. And they gave me such a hard time, and I thought, well, it's probably because it wasn't that they didn't agree with what I was saying, it's just they didn't really like it, except that I've just read one of their new books, and I've just seen all my ideas in his handwriting, so it's quite odd, actually. In fact, there was an academic from Australia sent an article to the journal that I edit, not knowing that I edit the journal, and she accused him of plagiarism, and I had to kind of send it back to her and I said, look, you're just a young academic. Do you really want to say this about a professor in Bolton? But anyway. So before we wade into this, there's something else to consider. Children and young people are also subject, and this seems dead obvious, but the amount of children's books and television shows and that don't even address this, are also subject to those other descriptors as diverse as gender, race, socio-economic status, and the many other subdivisions that we are. You know, the whole idea of kind of race and class and gender and stuff like that. And we just kind of label them to say they're children. They're children. And we kind of don't pay attention to that kind of thing as well. So what can be said is that people we call children are temporarily the inexperienced branch of the human family. And that experience is gained through a process of joint activity, where attending, remembering, and reasoning are things done between people of all ages. Most powerfully done between experts and novices, teachers and learners. And I would contend by writers, artists, and creators of story narrative, because most important in this proposal is the idea of joint activity between the experienced and the less so, between the critically creative and creatively critical discourse. As Benjamin said, if they are all fit and well, children are monsters of activity, where a child's action is a creative impulse which corresponds exactly to the receptive one. Now, the relationship between theory and practice in this sense is slightly different. Theory, the relationship between the relationship between theory and practice are far more partial and fragmentary. Practice is a set of relays from one theoretical point to another, and theory is a relay from one practice to another. No theory can develop without eventually encountering a wall, and practice is necessary for piercing this wall. And some of you might have read Deleuze before. It's in Foucault and Deleuze anyway. But later on, I'll come to address this in the paper, that idea of how do practice and theory sit side by side in this kind of relationship. Because in the project that Steph and I are working on called The Boat, the exciting challenge in a project like this is to explore the connections in the joint activity, which is fundamental to the underpinning of authentic child-centered discourse. You see, in creating textual culture for children, we should be aware that the responsible job, the writer, the artist, the storyteller, is to explore the same gap, the in-between space between them and the child, by providing a story which allows the gap between the parent and the child, or the reader and the child, or the writer and the child to be bridged. And as Deleuze also said, representation no longer exists. There's only action, theoretical action and practical action, which serves us really through the forms of networks. So this brings me on to the storytelling idea itself. And what I'm going to do, actually, is I'm just going to abandon this paper now at this point. Because I was very fortunate to have been a plenary speaker at the University of East Macedonia about 4 weeks ago. And I had to go and stay in a hotel right on the harbour in Corfu for a week. It was wonderful. And when I was there, I said to them that I said to them I would talk about Icarus and various other things. So I want you to think about this. As I was thinking about this story of this idea of this kind of Icarus boy, and I was thinking about myself as a writer, and what do I think about as writers and writers and artists and playwrights and performers and stuff. It's, we're kind of hovering above the story in that sense, aren't we? We're kind of above, we're watching it, we're grabbing a bit of this and we're taking a bit of that, and we're kind of sucking stuff in as well. And this is an Icarus that doesn't fall, he just keeps flying, because his father, Daedalus, was a liar anyway, So he just stays there, so he's kind of grabbing stories. And as he's grabbing these stories, he's kind of, thinking about the whole transmission. And I was trying to think about it like that, which kind of brings me on to, that's the Icarus boy. That was the nicest one I could get. There's a lot of rubbish pictures on the internet, aren't there? So I was thinking about this idea of kind of creating an omniscient narrator, somebody who could see what was going on in the world. And I was thinking to myself, would he come back? Would he come down? Would he tell us a story? Or do we just have to kind of try and interpret the story for ourselves? And so I started thinking about making some connections. So I'm going to make some connections on this, okay? This is Moses. You know the story of Moses, really, don't you? Exodus, 400 years had passed. Jacob's family was left at the land of Canaan. And the Egyptians had enough, and they said that there was too many children, so they decided to get rid of some of the kids and that. So Moses' mother put him in a basket and sent him down the Nile, okay? And if you go right back to the start of the story, when I started telling you about the paper, is that, we know that people, ever since there were people in the world, they've taken to the water, taken to the sea in search of a better life. So our story doesn't start with Moses, but it starts with a Moses kind of idea. We're thinking about a Moses kind of idea about how, a mother looking after a child, and eventually thinking about those people who have now come to be known as boat people. There was a serious accident off the coast of Corfu today. Was it today or yesterday, or Lesbos today? 26 more people died. I mean, they reckon only on the body count, there's about 2,500 people dying in that way a year. And that's only the bodies that they've managed to recover. The rest of them get eaten by the fish or whatever as well. So we're thinking about writing a story, introducing children to this whole idea of people going into the boat, and how can we introduce this to children, and the whole kind of idea about immigration and immigrants and problems and that kind of thing. And we decided that we would use pictures and a very short text. But it's easy. When you think about as adults, we understand what's going on. This is a wonderful installation by the artist Radcliffe Bailey. He's an American artist. I actually saw this in New Orleans, and these are piano keys. All these, and this black man here is drowning in a sea of piano keys. And Radcliffe Bailey was trying to put an installation together after Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, and he was trying to kind of explain what the black person has brought to American culture. So there's a lot of music involved in the exhibition. This is just part of the exhibition, but there's music, blues music, jazz music, that kind of stuff. And so he kind of takes this whole New Orleans setting. Meanwhile, we've got this black-head slave character drowning in the sea of music, and so there's a whole lot of stuff coming together. So I spent a long time in the exhibition because I just thought it was one of the most brilliant exhibitions I've ever seen in my entire life, and thinking about that. But I know I can make a story up about it. I can think about the story. I know about Hotel Katrina. I know about the history of jazz. I know about the history of blues music. I know the history of slavery and all these kind of things that were happening in America, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I can, I've already got the knowledge. I can do that in the story. You put something as abstract up to a child as abstract as this, and they've got no chance. They've got no chance of understanding what's going on at all. So then that's when we start to think about how we're going to compromise it. And then this is how we compromise it. We fast forward then to 2015. So I need to go by that. Yeah. Migrants seeking a better life in Europe. This is an actual boat. You might have seen this in The Guardian, for those of you. This is an aerial photograph of a real boat full of people who are called boat people trying to escape North Africa into Greece. They've died in their thousands in the Mediterranean Sea in recent years while fleeing poverty and bloodshed in Africa and the Middle East and Asia. The precise number of deaths is unknown. Authorities count only those bodies found in the sea. I found this out in my research. Many of whom are children. This year it's around 1,500 people, and on course to exceed the 2014 figure of 3,200 people. 3,200 people a year dying, in this migration. And so we thought, well, how do we tell this story? How do we tell this story to children? So Stephanie Wallace and I, who's sitting over there, had a conversation about it. We had a conversation about writing a children's picture book, which then became a picture book, and it became a website and an app, and it's going to be a picture book, it's going to be a website, it's going to be an app, it's going to be an exhibition. In fact, and I haven't told Steph this yet, but I've just received a letter 2 or 3 days ago from Australia inviting me, I think, take it over to Australia. As well, and so the whole thing's kind of picking it up pace. But let's just show you if we can get this mouse. It's this work, and there we go. So this is part of the reasoning behind the characters being like this. Is they've got no personalities, they've got no names. Nobody, because we don't know, do they? I mean. In Australia, what they're called in Australia, they're called the water problem in Australia. The water problem. They don't even call them boat people anymore because people object to them being called boat people. They become the water problem. That's what you get when you get to my age. You get a water problem, don't you? So we put this website together. Steph organised the website, as you can see. So it's all going to be kind of electronically visual for the boat is coming. There we go. And that's what we're kind of doing at the moment with it. All this, as you can see, we're now kind of approaching this. This looks great on your smartphone. You stick it on your smartphone and it kind of moves and that kind of thing as well. And so once we started with just a little idea that Steph and I were going to write this picture book, and my bit of it has been the best bit because I only had to write 350 words. and Steph's got to illustrate every single panel, but that's okay, because what we're doing is taking up this kind of situation because everybody in the entire world must have seen the picture of that, that 3-year-old boy on the beach in Dalamm in Turkey, didn't they? And we can't avoid children seeing those pictures, but at some point we have to kind of try and explain these kind of things to children. So the best way to do it is through the vicarious experience of a book. Because introducing difficult subjects to children is nowhere near as difficult as people make out. As I said at the beginning of this paper, a child's gestured creative impulses corresponds with the receptive ones. And we shouldn't be thinking about severing perception and action when engaging them with complex ideas and difficult topics. And in this case, the truth is that the term boat people doesn't get anywhere near close to describing the tragedy that keeps befalling people who are looking for a better life. For an adult, the project will elaborate on the critical and creative rationale of representation, but it will also demonstrate the role of the writers and the technologists, how a story can be constructed for an audience whose verbal and visual literacy is limited by their experience. And that's why we're going to take it on to electronic and books and exhibitions and that kind of thing as well. But this also brings us kind of back to what we do in creative writing at the university here, and what we think about, the kind of critical rationale behind some of the creative stuff that we do, is that artists, writers, critics, technologists engaged in culture, communication and media, because we're in this kind of CCMS type of remit, aren't we? By the way, the only complaint I had from the people when I gave this paper in Corfu was that we're getting seasick. Could I stop it? It's just those of us involved in art and writing and performance and stage and dance and all these kind of things actually have a responsibility to remember that the gap that exists between representation and reality, is loaded with possibilities. If the people represented to us in the boat, these people could speak, they would definitely not like to be remembered as boat people. They say, I don't want to be a boat person. I'm a nurse, or I'm a doctor, or I'm a mechanic, or what is a boat person? They would not want to be remembered this. But what they are people seeking a better life, people who want to live and love and be the people they are. But remember this, children also, in this context, have to stare at the possibilities of their own non-being, that is to say, their own death. They have to see the possibility that they too, at some point in their life are not necessarily going to be as safe as they are now. What they have to do, according to Marina Warner, however, is to discover that they are still alive and outside the story. So what the story does is introduces them to the potential of death, the potential of danger, the potential life that other people are having while they're outside the story. The story is there to kind of bring them into the whole idea behind life itself, and so the whole vicarious experience becomes exemplified by that, where the story can deliver the idea of danger and death as a potential, as a vicarious experience, not as didactic stories, not as this shouldn't be happening in the world, that sort of thing, because we don't do it like that. With the way we're doing the stories, we're telling a story about people are really happy when they get on the boat and they can't wait and they want to sing songs and dance and everything because they're going off to a better life. They don't know that when they get to this place called Europe that the people are going, no, we don't want you, go back, which is also part of the book as well. So it's not a didactic, in-your-face kind of story, but a story that allows them to engage in the good, the bad, and the ugly of this world. Thank you very much.